8 people. That is the number the Bible gives us. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and the 3 wives of those sons walked off the ark after the floodwaters receded. 8 people to restart the entire human race. Genesis 7 verse 23 says, "Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark." So, if the Nephilim, those terrifying giants of Genesis 6, drowned along with the rest of corrupt humanity, then why, just a few books later, do giants show up again? What nobody knew is that the answer has been sitting in the original Hebrew this entire time, and it changes everything about how we understand not just the flood, but the entire Old Testament. The answer to this question might also be the most important thing you hear this year about how God works in your life. And I know that sounds like a stretch, but stay with me. By the end of this, you will understand exactly what I mean. Think about this for a second. How does someone go from reading a genealogy in Genesis to suddenly understanding why that promotion at work fell through, or why the relationship they prayed for keeps hitting walls, or why every time they get close to a breakthrough, something massive rises up to block the way? That connection is real, and it lives inside this mystery. So let us open the case file. The first thing we need to do is go back to the scene that starts the whole controversy. Numbers chapter 13. Moses has sent 12 spies into Canaan to scout the land God has promised to Israel. They come back after 40 days, and 10 of the 12 spies are terrified. Numbers 13, verse 33. This is the verse that launched 1,000 arguments. The spies report back and say, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Now hold that verse in your mind and put it next to Genesis 7:23. Every living thing wiped out, only Noah left. You see the problem? The math does not work. If the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, they cannot be in Canaan hundreds of years later. So either the flood did not kill them all, or the spies were lying, or something else entirely is going on. And I need you to pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. If you are reading this in English, you probably see the word giants and assume every instance is talking about the same thing. One type of creature, one origin story, one simple category. That is what the English translation gives us. But the Hebrew tells a completely different story. Open the original Hebrew text of the Old Testament, and you will find not one, but 6 distinct words that English Bibles flatten into that single word, giants. And each word has a different root, a different meaning, and points to a different origin. This is where the detective case really begins. The first word, and the one that gets the most attention, is Nephilim. In Hebrew, it is spelled Nun Pelamd Yod Mem, and the root of this word is Nafal, which means to fall. The Nephilim are literally the fallen ones, not the tall ones, not the big ones, the fallen ones. This matters more than you think. The word itself is a theological statement, not a physical description. When Genesis 6 calls these beings Nephilim, it is making a claim about their nature, their origin, and their spiritual status. They fell, or they were the offspring of those who fell. Now the second word, Rephaim. This one appears all over the Old Testament, from Genesis to Isaiah to the Psalms. The root is Rapha, and depending on the context, it can mean shades, spirits of the dead, or the healers. In Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 26, the Rephaim are described not as living giants walking around on earth, but as inhabitants of Sheol, the realm of the dead. Read that again. The Hebrew word most often translated as giants in the post-flood narrative literally refers to shades of the dead in prophetic literature. The third word is Anakim. This comes from the root anak, meaning long-necked or those who wear neck chains. The Anakim were a specific clan, descended from a man named Anak, who was himself descended from Arba, the founder of the city of Kiriath Arba, which later became Hebron. These are real historical people with a traceable genealogy. The Bible gives us their family tree. The fourth word is Gibborim. This appears in Genesis 6, verse 4, right alongside Nephilim. The Gibborim were mighty men, warriors of renown. The root is Gabba, meaning to be strong or to prevail. In other parts of the Old Testament, this same word is used to describe David's elite soldiers. It is not necessarily a supernatural term at all. It can simply mean powerful warriors. The fifth word is Emim. Deuteronomy 2, verse 10 tells us the Emim formerly lived in the territory that Moab would later occupy. The name means the dreaded ones, or the terrors. They were described as a great and numerous people, as tall as the Anakim. And the sixth word is Zamzumim. Deuteronomy 2, verse 20 says the Ammonites called the Rephaim by this name. Zamzumim comes from a root meaning to murmur or to plot. Some scholars translate it as the schemers. 6 different words, 6 different roots, 6 different implications. And here is the part that should stop you in your tracks. The English Bible translates most of these as giants, all of them, as if they are the same thing, as if a being called the Fallen One, and a being called the Schemer, and a being called the Shade of the Dead are all just big, tall people. They are not. And this is where most YouTube videos on this topic get it wrong. They treat giants as a single category and then try to explain how that one category survived the flood. But the Hebrew is telling us something far more complicated and far more interesting. These are not all the same beings, and they do not all have the same origin. So now let us go back to the beginning and look at what actually happened before the flood. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. This is one of the most debated passages in the entire Bible, and for good reason. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The sons of God. In Hebrew, Bene Ha-Elohim. This exact phrase appears in only a handful of places in the Old Testament. Job 1, verse 6, Job 2, verse 1, Job 38, verse 7. And in every single one of those passages in Job, the Bene Ha-Elohim are clearly celestial beings, angels, members of the divine council. Now, there are Christians who argue that sons of God here means the godly line of Seth, and daughters of men means the ungodly line of Cain. That is a legitimate interpretation, and it has been held by serious theologians for centuries. But the Hebrew itself, and the way this exact phrase is used everywhere else in the Old Testament, points strongly toward celestial beings crossing a boundary they were never meant to cross. And if you are wondering whether the ancient Jewish world actually believed this, the answer is overwhelming. The Book of Enoch, a text written roughly 2 to 3 centuries before Jesus and widely read by Jewish communities throughout the Second Temple period, tells this story in vivid detail. First, Enoch calls these celestial beings the Watchers, angels assigned to observe humanity, who instead abandoned their station and descended to Mount Hermon in the northern reaches of ancient Israel. According to Enoch, they swore an oath together on that mountain, binding themselves to a plan they knew was forbidden. Now, the Book of Enoch is not in most Protestant or Catholic Bibles, but it is in the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, where it has been considered scripture for over 1,500 years. And early church fathers like Tertullian, Justin Martyr, and Irenaeus all referenced Enoch as if it were authoritative. The New Testament letter of Jude, verse 14, directly quotes 1st Enoch by name. So this was not a fringe text. For centuries, this was the mainstream understanding of Genesis 6. Why does this matter for our investigation? Because it tells us how the people closest to the original Hebrew text understood the Bene Ha-Elohim. They did not read Sons of God and think of Seth's descendants. They read it and thought of watchers, fallen celestial beings who crossed a line, produced the Nephilim, and triggered a divine judgment so severe that it drowned an entire world. That is the backdrop. That is the pre-flood world Genesis is describing. And once you see it through that lens, the flood stops being just a story about rain. It becomes a targeted reset of a creation that had been genetically and spiritually compromised at its core. And the result of that crossing, Genesis 6, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men, the Gibborim, who were of old, men of renown. This is the pre-flood world, the Nephilim, the fallen ones, and the Gibborim, the mighty warriors, existing as the product of a boundary violation between the spiritual realm and the human realm. So, God sends the flood, and according to the text, everything is destroyed. But here is a phrase most people speed past. Genesis 6, verse 4 does not just say, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. It says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. And also afterward. 3 words that have kept scholars awake for millennia, because afterward could mean after the sons of God began taking human wives, which is the immediate context, or it could be a parenthetical note by the author, likely Moses, acknowledging that the audience already knew about giants in their own time. A kind of editorial comment saying, you know those Nephilim, they were around back then too. This is one of those moments where a 2,000-year-old text reveals its layers. The phrase is genuinely ambiguous in Hebrew, and honest scholars on both sides will tell you that. But we do not need to solve that ambiguity to crack this case. Because the biggest clue is not in Genesis 6, it is in Genesis 7. And this is the detail that everyone overlooks. When God tells Noah to build the ark, he gives him specific instructions about who gets on board. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. 8 people. But here is what God says about Noah in Genesis 6, verse 9. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. The Hebrew word translated blameless here is tamim, and this word is fascinating. It does not mean morally perfect. It means complete, whole, without defect. It is the same word used in Leviticus to describe animals fit for sacrifice, unblemished, physically and genetically complete. Some scholars, and this is a minority view but a serious one, believe that Tamim here is describing Noah's genetic purity, that Noah was chosen not only because he was righteous in his behavior, but because his bloodline had not been corrupted by the Nephilim interbreeding described in the verses right before. And if that is what Tamim means in this context, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What about the wives? The Bible tells us Noah was blameless. Tamim, complete in his generations. But it says nothing about the 3 women who married his sons. Nothing. Let me give you a modern analogy to show you why that silence might be the loudest clue in the whole story. Think about recessive genes. 2 parents with brown eyes can have a blue-eyed child if they both carry the recessive gene for blue eyes. The trait is invisible in the parents but present in their DNA, waiting for the right combination to express itself. Now, imagine the pre-flood world. If the Nephilim bloodline, this corrupted hybrid lineage, had been interbreeding with humanity for generations, it is entirely possible that the genetic markers for unusual size and strength could exist as recessive traits in women who appeared completely normal, women who might even have been considered good matches for Noah's sons. God chose Noah because his line was tamim, unblemished, but the wives came from the general population, and the general population had been interbreeding with the Nephilim for an unspecified but potentially very long period of time. If even one of those 3 wives carried recessive genetic material from the Nephilim bloodline, it would explain how traits associated with unusual size and strength could re-emerge in later generations, long after the flood had killed every living Nephilim. This is the carrier hypothesis, and it is one of the most widely discussed explanations among serious biblical scholars. Now, I want to be honest with you, this is a theory. The Bible does not explicitly state that the wives carried Nephilim genetics. What the Bible does is give us a strange silence about their lineage, right next to a very specific statement about Noah's genetic completeness. And that juxtaposition, whether intentional or not, has been noticed by readers for over 2,000 years. But here is where things take a turn nobody expected. What if the post-flood giants were not related to the pre-flood Nephilim at all? This is the part where we need to let go of our assumptions and follow the Hebrew. Because when we look at the post-flood texts carefully, the word Nephilim barely appears. The dominant term for giants after the flood is Rephaim. And, as we already established, these are 2 completely different words with 2 completely different meanings. Nephilim, the fallen ones. Rephaim, the shades, the dead ones. These are not synonyms. They are not interchangeable. And the fact that English Bibles treat them as the same word is one of the great translation tragedies of biblical scholarship. The only post-flood appearance of the actual word Nephilim is that single verse in Numbers 13:33, the spies report. And this is where things get really interesting, because there is a massive clue in the text that most people miss. Go back and read Numbers 13 carefully. The 12 spies go into Canaan. They come back. 10 of them give a bad report. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, give a good report. And the text itself, the narrator, tells us in verse 32 that the 10 spies spread a bad report. The Hebrew word used is dibba, which means slander, defamation, an evil report. The narrator is telling us, before the spies even open their mouths, that what they are about to say is unreliable. But verse 33 is where the spies claim they saw the Nephilim. Remember, the text just told us this is a slanderous report. These are terrified men trying to convince an entire nation not to enter the promised land. They're exaggerating. They are fear-mongering. We seemed like grasshoppers to ourselves is not sober military intelligence. It is panic. So were there actually Nephilim in Canaan? The text, read carefully in Hebrew, strongly suggests the answer is no. The spies saw large people, probably Anakim, and called them Nephilim to make their report more terrifying. They used the scariest word they knew, the name of the legendary pre-flood monsters, to describe what were likely very tall but entirely human warriors. And yet, even with the Nephilim question resolved, we still have giants everywhere in the post-flood narrative. The Rephaim are all over Deuteronomy, Joshua, and 2 Samuel, and their presence is not based on a slanderous report. It is stated as historical fact by the narrator. So what are the Rephaim? This is where Deuteronomy chapters 2 and 3 become the most important giant-related text in the Bible, because Moses, speaking to the Israelites before they enter the Promised Land, gives them a detailed catalogue of every giant clan that once occupied the territory they are about to claim. He starts with the Emim, Deuteronomy 2 verse 10. The Emim had formerly lived there, a people great and many, and as tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. Then the Horites in Seir, who were dispossessed by Esau's descendants. Then the Zamzummim, Deuteronomy 2, verse 20. It is also counted as a land of the Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzummim, a people great and many, and as tall as the Anakim. Look at the pattern. Moses is systematically listing every giant clan in the region, noting their local names, their territories, and, critically, the fact that they were all eventually dispossessed by other nations. The Moabites drove out the Emim, the Ammonites drove out the Zamzummim, Esau's descendants drove out the Horites. And God is telling Israel, if those nations could defeat those giants with my help, so can you. Think about that for a second. God is not hiding the existence of giants from Israel. He is pointing them out, naming them, cataloging them, and then saying, look, they have already been defeated by nations less blessed than you. What are you afraid of? The same God who drowned the Nephilim in the flood is now pointing at the Rephaim and saying, these are not the monsters you think they are. They are obstacles, and obstacles are what I specialize in. And there is one man in the biblical record who understood this better than anyone. His name was Caleb. Remember, he was one of the 2 spies, alongside Joshua, who refused to give a fearful report when the other 10 panicked about the Nephilim in Numbers 13. While the other spies said, we are like grasshoppers, Caleb said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. That was 45 years before what happens next. And this next part might be the most underrated scene in the entire Old Testament, Joshua 14. The land is being divided among the tribes of Israel. Caleb, now 85 years old, walks up to Joshua and makes an audacious request. He does not ask for the easy territory. He does not ask for the flat, fertile plains where the weak enemies live. He asks for Hebron, the mountain country, the exact place where the Anakim, the giant clan descended from Anak, still had their strongest fortifications. Listen to what Caleb says in Joshua 14 verse 12. Give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as the Lord said. An 85-year-old man looked at the most fortified giant stronghold in Canaan and said, give me that one, specifically that one. And Joshua 15 verse 14 tells us what happened. Caleb drove out the 3 sons of Anak from Hebron, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, 3 named giants, personally evicted by a man who was 40 years past what anyone would consider fighting age. Why? Because Caleb had been carrying this promise for 45 years. He saw the giants as a young man and said yes. He waited through 4 decades of wilderness wandering, and when he finally got the chance, he did not pick an easier fight. He picked the hardest one, because that was the promise. and the promise was worth the giant. If that does not hit close to home, I do not know what would. If you are finding value in this, take a second and hit subscribe. We explore Bible mysteries like this every week, diving into the Hebrew and Greek to find what English translations miss. While Israel was preparing to enter the Promised Land, there was one giant who loomed larger than all the others, and his story takes us into one of the strangest verses in the entire Bible. His name was Og, the king of Bashan, and Deuteronomy 3, verse 11, gives us this remarkable detail. For only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. 9 cubits by 4 cubits, that is roughly 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide, by the standard cubit of about 18 inches. An iron bed, the size of a modern king-size bed, and then some. Now, a few things about this verse that should jump out at you. First, Moses says Og was the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, not the Nephilim, the Rephaim. This is a post-flood category. Moses, who is narrating this, makes the distinction even though he was also the author of Genesis, where the word Nephilim appears. If he thought they were the same thing, why use a different word? Second, the bed was in Rabbah of the Ammonites. Moses is telling the audience they can go see it for themselves. This is not legend. This is verifiable evidence. Moses is essentially saying, do not take my word for it. The bed is on display in the Ammonite capital right now. Third, the bed is made of iron. In the ancient Near East, iron was rare and precious during this period. An iron bed of this size was not just furniture. It was a monument, a statement of power, a throne of sorts. Og was making a visual claim to dominance through the sheer scale of his possessions, and God tells Moses to defeat him. Numbers 21, verse 34. Do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands, along with his whole army and his land, the last of the Rephaim, the greatest giant king of the post-flood world, defeated by a nation of former slaves, led by an 80-year-old man with a speech impediment. And no, I am not making that up. Moses himself tells us in Exodus 4 that he was slow of speech and slow of tongue. This decision, to send the least likely army against the last great giant, was not accidental. It was the whole point. The story of the giants does not end with Og. It has one more chapter, and it might be the most famous one. About 400 years after Moses, a shepherd boy named David walks into the valley of Elah and faces a giant named Goliath. 1 Samuel 17 gives us Goliath's measurements. He stood roughly 9 feet 9 inches tall, depending on whether you use the Hebrew Masoretic text or the Greek Septuagint, which gives a shorter height of about 6 feet 9 inches. Either way, he was enormous. His armor alone weighed about 125 pounds. The iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. And here is the connection that ties this whole investigation together. 2 Samuel 21 tells us that Goliath had brothers, and it identifies them as descendants of the Rapha, not the Nephilim. The Rapha. That is the singular form of Rephaim. Goliath and his family were the last of the Rephaim bloodline, the very same category of being that Og belonged to, the same word that traces through Deuteronomy's catalogue of giant clans, the same Hebrew term that, in its prophetic usage, means shades of the dead. David kills Goliath, and his mighty men, his own Gibborim, kill Goliath's brothers in the passages that follow. 2 Samuel 21 verses 15 through 22 describe 4 separate battles where David's warriors take down these last Rephaim descendants, one by one. But there is one more detail that seals this entire case, and almost nobody talks about it. There is a real physical valley just southwest of ancient Jerusalem called the Emek Rephaim, the Valley of the Rephaim. It is right there in the landscape of Israel, named after these very beings. And 2 Samuel 5 tells us David fought the Philistines in that valley twice, 2 separate battles in the Valley of the Giants. What makes this fascinating is that God gave David different instructions for each battle. The first time, in verse 19, God said, "Go straight up and attack." The second time, in verse 23, God said, "Do not go straight up. Circle around behind them and wait for the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees." Marching in the tops of the trees. That is one of the most mysterious tactical commands in the entire Bible. Some scholars believe God was telling David to wait for the sound of angelic armies moving above the battlefield before advancing. But here is the practical lesson buried in the story. God did not give David a formula. He gave him a relationship. The strategy that worked the first time was wrong for the second time. David had to go back and ask again. The giants were in the same valley, but the approach had to change. And that applies to every giant you will ever face. What worked against your last obstacle might not work against this one. The constant is not the method. The constant is the source you go back to for instructions. And then they are gone. After 2 Samuel 21, giants never appear in the biblical narrative again. The Rephaim are finished. The Anakim are absorbed. The Emim and the Zamzumim are distant memories. The entire phenomenon of giant clans in the Promised Land is over. So let us pull back and look at the whole case file now. What have we actually discovered? First, the English word giants hides 6 different Hebrew words with 6 different meanings: Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim, Gibborim, Emim, and Zamzumim. Treating them as interchangeable creates a false contradiction. Second, the actual word Nephilim, the fallen ones, appears only twice in the Hebrew Bible: Genesis 6, before the flood, and Numbers 13, in a report the narrator explicitly labels as slanderous. Every other post-flood reference to giants uses different Hebrew terms, primarily Rephaim. Third, the Rephaim may represent an entirely different phenomenon from the Nephilim. Whether they were the result of a second incursion of spiritual beings, or the re-emergence of recessive genetic traits carried through Noah's daughters-in-law, or simply an ancient population of unusually large humans whom God placed in the path of Israel as tests of faith, the text treats them as a distinct category. Fourth, and this is the detail that ties everything together, the Rephaim appear almost exclusively in the territory God promised to Israel. The Emim were in the land the Moabites would claim. The Zamzumim were in the land the Ammonites would claim. The Anakim were in the land Israel would claim. Og ruled Bashan, which was part of the Promised Land. Goliath stood in the valley of Elah, blocking Israel's access to Philistine territory. Giants stood in the doorway of every promise God made, every single one. And that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is where this stops being an academic Bible study and starts being about your life. Think about the biggest promise God has put on your heart, the calling you feel pulled toward, the healing you have been praying for, the relationship you believe is part of your future, the purpose you sense but cannot quite reach. Now, think about the biggest obstacle standing between you and that promise, the fear the financial impossibility, the person who keeps blocking your path, the voice in your head that says you are not enough. The biblical pattern is staggering in its consistency. Every time God makes a promise, a giant shows up in the territory of that promise. Not randomly, not as punishment, but as the thing that must be faced and defeated before the promise can be claimed. The Israelites could not enter Canaan without facing the Anakim. David could not secure his kingdom without killing Goliath. Moses could not lead the nation across the Jordan without defeating Og. The giant is not a sign that the promise is fake. The giant is a sign that the promise is real, because if there was nothing valuable on the other side, nothing would be guarding the door. And here is something worth noticing. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Ephesus centuries after the last Rephaim fell, uses language that sounds like it was pulled directly from this Old Testament giant narrative. Ephesians 6, verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Paul is writing in Greek, not Hebrew. But the pattern is identical. The enemy is not what you can see. It is what stands behind what you can see. The Nephilim were not just tall people. They were the product of a spiritual boundary violation. The Rephaim were not just big warriors. Their very name connected them to the realm of the dead. And Paul is saying, your struggles follow the same architecture. There is a visible obstacle, and behind it, a spiritual reality you cannot afford to ignore. This is not mystical hand-waving. This is the consistent testimony of Scripture from Genesis to Ephesians. The battles that matter most are never purely physical, and the victories that last are never won by human strength alone. Think about someone you know, or maybe it is you, who almost gave up on something right before the breakthrough. The business that was failing and then turned around in the 11th hour. The marriage that was one conversation away from ending and somehow survived. The prayer that had been repeated for years with no answer until one ordinary Tuesday, everything shifted. Looking back, the giant was biggest right before it fell. That is the pattern. The opposition is loudest at the threshold of the promise, and the people who break through are not the ones who were never afraid. They are the ones who kept walking toward the mountain while shaking. Just like Caleb, just like David, just like Moses. Read through the Old Testament with this lens, and it will change how you see every struggle in your life. The size of your giant is directly proportional to the size of your promise. And here is the part that should give you chills. Every giant in the Bible was defeated, every single one. The Emim, conquered by Moab. The Zamzummim, driven out by the Ammonites. The Anakim, destroyed by Joshua. Og, killed by Israel. Goliath, taken down by a teenager with a sling. Not one giant in Scripture proved to be unbeatable. Not one. And the beings who defeated them were never the obvious choice. It was never the biggest army or the strongest warrior. It was the Moabites, a small nation. It was Moses, a man who could not speak well. It was David, a boy who was not even invited to the battle. God consistently chose the least likely candidate to bring down the biggest enemy, because the point was never human strength. The point was always divine backing. The question was never, are you big enough to beat this giant? The question was always, do you trust that God is? The Hebrew word for Rephaim, those post-flood giants, comes from a root that can mean the dead ones or the shades. And there is a profound irony in that meaning. The very beings who seemed the most terrifyingly alive, the most physically overwhelming, the most impossible to overcome, were carrying a name that meant death and shadow. They looked invincible. Their name said otherwise. Your giants look invincible too. The diagnosis that terrifies you, the debt that feels impossible, the dream that everyone around you says is unrealistic. They look like Goliath. They feel like Og. They tower over you like the Anakim. But their name, if you could read it in the original language, would tell a different story. They are shades. They are shadows of something that has already been defeated. That is what the post-flood giants teach us. Not just where they came from, but where they went. Every single one of them was removed from the land God promised to his people, and the ones who removed them were the least powerful people in the room. So back to the original question. If only Noah's family survived the flood, where did the post-flood giants come from? The honest answer is that the Bible gives us clues, not a complete explanation. The carrier hypothesis through Noah's daughters-in-law is possible. A second incursion of spiritual beings is possible. The Repim, representing an entirely different phenomenon from the pre-flood Nephilim, is strongly supported by the Hebrew, and the spies in Numbers exaggerating their report to invoke Nephilim terror is clearly indicated by the text itself. But the deeper answer, the one the biblical authors seem far more interested in than the genetics, is this. It doesn't matter where the giants came from. What matters is that God placed his people on a collision course with them on purpose and gave them the power to win. The real question is not, where did the post-flood giants come from? The real question is, what are you going to do about the giants standing between you and the life God promised you? Because if the pattern of Scripture holds, and it has for every single person in this story, the giant falls. Every time. If this changed how you see the Bible or how you see your own struggles, you are going to want to watch the video on screen next. It goes deeper into the Hebrew behind another passage that English translations get completely wrong, and what it reveals might be even more surprising than this one. I will see you there.